For 15 years, Isolde Berren walked the same mountain trail with her old shovel and canvas pack. The people of Cedar Hollow watched her climb toward the cliff every summer, always returning to dig in the same weathered spot overlooking the valley. They called her the Hermitette of Hawk's Edge and made jokes about buried treasure and crazy old women. The men at the hardware store spun wild stories over coffee, but none of them ever asked why she kept digging. When retired surveyor Nolan Thresher found her camp that autumn afternoon, he saw something different in her quiet determination. The earth beneath her hands held secrets that ran deeper than anyone imagined, secrets that would shake this small town's understanding of courage and sacrifice. What could drive a woman to dig in the same place for 15 years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sometimes a town becomes so comfortable with its judgments that it forgets the people behind them. Cedar Hollow had watched Isolde Berren for 15 years, crafting stories about her solitary journeys while never once wondering about the grief that might drive an elderly woman to climb a mountain with nothing but a shovel and unshakable purpose. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the valley floor as morning mist clung to Main Street like whispered memories. Cedar Hollow stretched barely 4 blocks before surrendering to farmland and forest, its weathered storefronts bearing the quiet dignity of a town that had learned to endure rather than thrive. The mountains rose beyond like ancient sentinels, their peaks already dusted with the year's first snow. At Merrill's Hardware, the morning ritual had begun with the reliability of church bells. 4 men in their 60s and 70s gathered around the pot-bellied stove, their conversations meandering like the creek that ran behind the store. Steam rose from their coffee cups as they settled into chairs, worn smooth by decades of similar gatherings, each man claiming his preferred spot with the unspoken certainty of long habit. Vernon Patch, the town's unofficial keeper of gossip, leaned forward in his chair with the satisfaction of someone who'd spotted unusual wildlife. "Saw her again yesterday morning," he announced, his voice carrying across the store's cluttered aisles. "Heading up the old logging road with that pack of hers, same as always. Woman moves like she's got purpose, I'll give her that." The others knew immediately who he meant. Isolde Berren, though most of them couldn't recall if they'd ever learned her first name, had become their most reliable source of speculation during these morning sessions. She represented one of life's small mysteries, the kind that made comfortable men feel wise when they crafted explanations. For what they couldn't understand, Roy Caldwell shook, his grey head with the bemused expression of someone observing a particularly stubborn puzzle. 15 years now, near as I can figure. 15 summers, same trail, same destination up at Hawk's Edge. Woman's got to be pushing 73 herself, and she still makes that climb like she's half her age. Duncan Mills, who prided himself on knowing everyone's business in Cedar Hollow, nodded with the authority of a man who collected details like other folks collected stamps. 73 this past spring, according to the voter rolls. Lives in that blue cottage on Maple Street, the one with the overgrown garden. Keeps to herself mostly, except for her weekly grocery runs and those monthly trips to the library. "Speaking of the library," Vernon added, settling deeper into his chair, "Martha tells me she's read everything they have about the valley's mining days twice over, always checking out books about geology and local history. Woman's got herself a genuine education in rocks and dirt, seems like." The conversation paused as each man contemplated this familiar mystery. Through the store's front window, they could see the distant tree line where the hiking trail disappeared into wilderness. Somewhere up there, beyond their sight and understanding, a solitary woman pursued a purpose they couldn't fathom. It had become as much a part of their seasonal routine as watching for the first spring robins or the last autumn leaves. Roy shifted in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "My money's still on buried treasure," he declared, not for the first time. "These mountains are full of stories about lost mining claims and hidden gold. Maybe her family had a stake in something up there, something that got forgotten when the big mines closed down." Could be she's just eccentric, suggested Duncan, with the practical tone of a man who'd seen his share of small-town characters. Lord knows this valley's produced its share of folks who march to their own drummer. Remember old Henrik Johansson? Spent 20 years convinced there were Viking ruins in Wolf's Canyon. Never found so much as an arrowhead, but he sure wore out a lot of hiking boots looking. Vernon chuckled, the sound warming the store's morning quiet. Henrik was harmless enough, God rest him. At least he used to tell folks what he was looking for. This barren woman, she keeps her business to herself. Makes a person curious, you know. The bell above the door chimed with its familiar brass voice as another regular customer entered. Nolan Thresher moved with the careful precision of a man who'd spent decades measuring and mapping the world around him, each step deliberate and considered. At 67, retirement sat uneasily on his shoulders like an ill-fitting coat, leaving him with too much time to notice things he'd previously overlooked during his working years. His old surveyor's transit sat on the passenger seat of his truck outside, a faithful instrument that had helped him understand the shape of the land for 40 years. These days it mostly gathered dust, another reminder of a purpose that had defined him until Martha's death 6 months ago left him adrift in a world that suddenly seemed too large and too quiet. Morning. Nolan, the group chorused with the easy familiarity of men who'd known each other since high school. They made space for him near the stove, shifting their chairs with the unconscious choreography of old friendship, but he remained standing, his weathered hands wrapped around a travel mug of coffee that had grown cold during his morning walk. "You boys discussing our mountain hermit again?" Nolan asked, though his tone held more genuine curiosity than the casual mockery that usually colored their conversations about Isolde Barron. Vernon grinned and gestured toward the window with theatrical flair. "The Hermitette of Hawk's Edge," he proclaimed, savoring the nickname he'd coined years earlier. "Still making her pilgrimages to nowhere, regular as clockwork. Though I suppose we should call them autumn pilgrimages now, what with the season changing." Nolan had heard this conversation countless times since returning to Cedar Hollow after Martha's funeral. Each telling grew more elaborate, more removed from whatever reality drove Isolde Barron up that mountain trail. He found himself wondering about the woman behind their speculation, not the character they'd created in their comfortable assumptions, but the person who chose solitude over their casual judgment. The morning light shifted through the store window, casting new shadows across the weathered floorboards. Nolan studied the faces of his companions, seeing in them a reflection of his own tendency to explain away what he didn't understand. They were good men, decent neighbors who'd offered genuine comfort during his darkest months. But their easy dismissal of Isolde's purpose bothered him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. "Any of you ever actually talked to her?" Nolan asked, his voice quiet, but carrying clearly in the store's morning stillness. The question hung in the air like smoke from the old stove. The men exchanged glances, suddenly aware of the assumption that had colored 15 years of speculation. Duncan cleared his throat and shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Well, she's not exactly what you'd call approachable," Duncan offered, though his tone suggested he recognized the weakness of his excuse. "Nods politely enough at the grocery store, says her please and thank yous, but she doesn't encourage conversation. Some folks just prefer their privacy. Maybe she's got good reason for that," Nolan said, his words carrying a weight that made the others look at him more carefully. 15 years of people talking about you, making up stories about what you're doing, might make a person cautious about opening up to strangers." Vernon's expression grew thoughtful, some of his earlier amusement fading. "You think we've been unfair to her?" Nolan considered the question, rolling his coffee mug between his palms. Outside, Cedar Hollow continued its quiet morning routine, the same peaceful rhythm that had comforted him during his return to his hometown. But comfort, he was learning, could sometimes blind a person to the struggles happening just beyond their familiar routines. "I think," Nolan said carefully, "that a woman who spends 15 years climbing a mountain with a shovel probably has her reasons. And I think those reasons might be worth understanding before we decide she's just eccentric. The conversation settled into thoughtful silence, each man wrestling with implications they hadn't considered. Roy stood and refilled his coffee cup from the pot that Vernon kept warm on the stove, the familiar ritual providing a moment's distraction from uncomfortable self-reflection. "You planning to ask her?" Roy asked when he returned to his chair. "Next time you're up on the trails?" Nolan had been thinking about that very possibility for weeks now, ever since the restlessness of retirement had driven him back to the mountain paths he'd surveyed in his younger years. His old hiking boots still fit, and his legs still remembered the rhythm of climbing. But these days, he walked more for the peace of movement than any professional purpose. "Maybe I will," Nolan replied, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Trail season's almost over, but there's still time for a few more climbs before the snow flies. "Might be interesting to see what draws her up there." Duncan nodded slowly, his expression suggesting a man reconsidering long-held assumptions. "If you do talk to her, you'll let us know what you find out." "Not for gossip's sake," he added quickly, "but because, well, we've been wondering about her for so long. Seems like we owe her the courtesy of actual curiosity instead of just speculation." The bell chimed again as a customer entered seeking garden supplies, and the conversation shifted to more practical matters of mulching and winter preparation. But something had changed in the store's comfortable routine. A small crack in the foundation of assumptions that had supported 15 years of casual judgment. As Nolan walked home through Cedar Hollow's quiet streets, his surveyor's eye automatically noted the angles of shadows and the precise way morning light struck the mountains. His old transit might be gathering dust, but his need to understand the shape of things remained as sharp as ever. And lately, that need had begun focusing on questions that couldn't be answered with instruments and mathematics. What drove a 73-year-old woman to climb a mountain with nothing but determination and a shovel? What secrets might lie buried at Hawk's Edge that could sustain 15 years of solitary searching? And why had he and his neighbors spent so long crafting comfortable explanations instead of simply asking? The questions followed him home like faithful dogs, settling into his thoughts with the persistence of problems that demanded solving. By the time he reached his front porch, Nolan had made a decision that would change everything he thought he knew about Cedar Hollow's mountain hermit. 3 days later, Nolan chose the northern trail that wound toward Hawk's Edge through stands of aspen and pine. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and his breath formed small clouds as he climbed steadily through the morning shadows. He'd packed light, water, a sandwich, and his old compass out of habit, but found his steps quickening with something that felt suspiciously like anticipation. The trail split twice before opening onto the rocky outcrop where Vernon claimed to have spotted Isolde Berrin countless times over the years. Nolan emerged from the tree line, expecting to find evidence of her presence. Disturbed earth, perhaps, or the kind of systematic excavation that 15 years of digging might produce. What he found instead was a woman kneeling beside a barely visible depression in the stony ground, her weathered hands working with the careful precision of someone who understood that haste could destroy what patience might reveal. She looked up at his approach, her grey eyes holding the wariness of someone long accustomed to being observed rather than understood. Isolde Berrin was smaller than he'd expected, her frame compact and strong despite her years, her silver hair pulled back in a practical braid that spoke of function over vanity. She wore hiking clothes that had seen serious use, sturdy boots, canvas pants, and a wool sweater that bore the soft patina of many mountain mornings. "I'm sorry," Nolan said, stopping several feet away to avoid seeming intrusive. "I didn't mean to disturb your work. I'm Nolan Thresher. I live down in Cedar Hollow." Her expression didn't soften, but neither did it harden into outright hostility. "I know who you are," she replied, her voice carrying the slight accent of someone who'd spoken other languages before settling on English. "You're the surveyor. Your wife was Martha, the one who organized the church bake sales." The mention of Martha caught him off guard, a familiar ache settling in his chest. "You knew her?" "She was kind to me at the grocery store," Isolde said simply. "Asked about my garden once, didn't pry when I gave short answers. Good woman." I was sorry to hear about her passing. They stood in silence for a moment, the wind moving through the pine boughs above them with a sound like distant conversation. Nolan noticed the methodical way Isolde had arranged her tools beside the excavation site. A small hand shovel, a brush, a folding trowel, all cleaned and organized with the care of someone who treated her equipment as trusted companions. 15 years, he said, not making it a question. 15 years, she confirmed, returning to her careful work. "Though I suspect you didn't climb all this way just to confirm what the men at the hardware store already know." Nolan felt heat rise in his cheeks. "They mean no harm by their talk, I know." Isolde's hands never paused in their methodical movement. "Small towns need their mysteries. They're harmless eccentrics. I've been both for long enough to understand the comfort it provides." As she spoke, the western sky began to darken with the ominous grey-black of an autumn storm. Mountain weather could change with brutal swiftness, and Nolan recognized the signs of a system that would bring more than just rain. He glanced at his watch, barely past noon, but the approaching clouds suggested they had perhaps an hour before conditions became dangerous. "Storm's coming," he said, stating the obvious because sometimes obvious truths were the only safe ground for conversation. Isolde looked up at the sky with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read mountain weather through necessity rather than choice. "Yes," she agreed. "A big one. I should pack up." But instead of moving toward her equipment, she continued working, her movements becoming more urgent, but no less careful. Nolan watched her for several minutes, noting the way she seemed to be following some internal map. Her attention focused on a specific area no larger than a dinner table. "May I ask what you're looking for?" he said finally, her hands stilled for the first time since he'd arrived. When she looked up at him, something in her expression had changed, not softening exactly, but shifting toward a decision she hadn't expected to make. "Something that was lost," she said. "Something that was promised." The first raindrops began to fall, fat and cold, against the exposed stone around them. Within minutes, the drops became a steady patter, then a driving rain that would make the trail treacherous and the exposed cliff face dangerous. Nolan looked around for shelter and spotted a shallow overhang about 20 yards away, carved into the cliff by decades of wind and weather. "We should get under cover," he said. Raising his voice over the increasing drum of rain against stone, Isolde gathered her tools with practiced efficiency, wrapping them in oilcloth before shouldering her canvas pack. Together, they hurried to the overhang, arriving just as the storm unleashed its full fury. Lightning flickered through the clouds, followed by thunder that echoed off the valley walls like artillery fire. The overhang provided adequate shelter, but forced them into close proximity. Nolan found himself studying Isolde's profile as she watched the storm, noting the fine lines around her eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into wind and weather, the calluses on her hands that told stories of persistent labor. This was not the eccentric recluse of hardware store speculation. This was a woman with purpose, driven by something deeper than casual curiosity or idle obsession. "You're not going to ask me about treasure," she said without looking at him, "or secret maps, or family legends about buried gold." "No," Nolan agreed. "I'm not." She turned to face him then, and he saw something in her expression that might have been relief. "The men in town, they mean well, but they think in simple stories. Lost gold, family secrets, the kind of mysteries that have comfortable explanations. And your mystery doesn't have a comfortable explanation." Isolde was quiet for so long that Nolan began to think she wouldn't answer. The storm raged around their small shelter, turning the world beyond into a grey curtain of driving rain and wind. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible above the weather. "There was a German prisoner of war camp in this valley during the war," she said. 1943 to 1945. Most people have forgotten it existed, but I worked there as a translator. I was 19, spoke German because my grandmother taught me, and the government needed young women who could help with prisoner interviews. Nolan felt something shift in his understanding. Puzzle pieces beginning to arrange themselves into patterns he hadn't expected. "You met someone there?" "Klaus," she said, and the name carried weight that 15 years hadn't diminished. Klaus Hoffmann. He was 22, captured in North Africa, sent here because he wasn't considered a high-security risk. He was an artist before the war, a woodcarver who'd been conscripted into service he never wanted. She reached into her pack and withdrew something wrapped in soft cloth. When she unwrapped it, Nolan saw a small wooden bird carved with extraordinary detail and skill. Even in the storm's grey light, the craftsmanship was evident. Every feather defined, the curve of the beak perfect. The entire piece smoothed to a warm patina by years of careful handling. "He made this for me," Isolde continued, her fingers tracing the carved lines with unconscious tenderness. "We fell in love, which was forbidden and dangerous and probably foolish, but love doesn't ask permission from wars or governments or sensible people who know better." Thunder crashed overhead, but neither of them flinched. Nolan found himself leaning forward, drawn into a story that explained everything and nothing about the woman who'd spent 15 years digging beside a cliff before he was transferred to another camp. "Klaus buried something here," Isolde said. "Letters, mostly, and some personal items he'd managed to keep. He wanted me to have them if anything happened to him. We made a promise to meet here after the war, to dig up what he'd hidden and start a life together somewhere far from the memories of conflict. But he never came back," Nolan said gently. "He never came back," she confirmed. "I waited 3 years after the war ended, then got married to a good man who understood that some parts of my heart would always belong to someone else. We had 40 good years together before he passed. But Klaus I never forgot. And the promise I made, I never kept." The storm began to ease, the driving rain settling into a steady but manageable fall. Through the grey curtain, Nolan could see the excavation site where Isolde had been working, now partially filled with muddy water, but somehow still holding the shape of careful, systematic searching. "So you came back," he said, 15 years ago, after my husband died, and I realized that some promises don't expire just because time passes. I've been looking for Klaus's burial site ever since, trying to keep faith with a 22-year-old boy who trusted me with his most precious possessions." She rewrapped the wooden bird and returned it to her pack, her movements gentle but decisive. "Now you know what the men at the hardware store would make of that story. A foolish old woman chasing ghosts and promises that should have been forgotten decades ago." Nolan considered her words as the storm continued its retreat across the valley. He thought about Martha, about the promises he'd made and kept unbroken during their marriage, about the weight of commitments that outlived the people who made them. "I think," he said carefully, "that a promise is a promise, regardless of how much time passes. And I think 15 years of searching takes a kind of courage that most people wouldn't understand." Isolde looked at him with something that might have been surprise. "You're not what I expected from a surveyor." "Maybe," Nolan said, watching the rain ease toward drizzle. "And you're not what anyone expected from the hermitet of Hawk's Edge." For the first time since he'd met her, Isolde almost smiled. "That's a terrible nickname. Vernon Patch came up with it. He's proud of his creative flair." "Vernon Patch," she repeated, shaking her head. "The man who thought my digging was performance art for the tourists." They sat in comfortable silence as the storm finished its passage, leaving the mountain air clean and sharp with the scent of wet stone and pine. When the rain finally stopped, Isolde gathered her pack and prepared to leave the shelter. "The trail will be slippery," Nolan said. "Dangerous for a descent." "I've made this climb in worse weather," she replied, but without defensiveness. "Though I appreciate the concern." He stood as she shouldered her pack, struck by an impulse that surprised him. "Would you mind if I came back?" "To help with the digging, I mean. I've got experience reading terrain, and an extra pair of hands might be useful." Isolde studied his face for a long moment, her grey eyes searching for something, sincerity perhaps, or the absence of mockery. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her. Klaus would have liked you, she said finally. He appreciated people who took their commitments seriously. As they carefully made their way down the treacherous trail, Nolan found himself already planning his return to Hawk's Edge. He had tools that might be useful, knowledge that could help, and perhaps most importantly, he had time. Endless hours of retirement that had felt like burden until now. Behind them, the cliff face gleamed wet and clean in the afternoon light, holding its secrets a little longer, but somehow seeming less mysterious than it had that morning. Sometimes, Nolan reflected, the best way to solve a mystery wasn't to explain it away, but to step inside it and help it reach its natural conclusion. Nolan returned to Hawk's Edge 3 days later with a canvas bag containing proper archaeological tools: brushes, measuring tape, a small sifting screen, and a folding camp stool that Martha had used for her garden work. The morning was clear and cold, with frost still glittering on the exposed stone when he reached the cliffside just after sunrise. Isolde was already there, kneeling beside yesterday's excavation with the patience of someone who'd learned that the earth revealed its secrets slowly. She looked up at his approach with something that might have been relief, though she covered it quickly with her customary reserve. "You came back," she said, stating fact rather than expressing surprise. "I said I would." Nolan set down his bag and withdrew the camp stool, unfolding it with the careful attention Martha had always brought to practical tasks. "Thought you might appreciate having somewhere to rest between digging sessions." Isolde's eyes lingered on the stool for a moment, and he wondered if she recognized it as something that had belonged to someone who was no longer here. "Thank you," she said simply. The ground gets hard on old knees after a few hours. They worked in companionable silence for the first hour, Nolan following Isolde's careful methodology as she taught him to read the subtle differences in soil color and texture that might indicate previous disturbance. She moved with the systematic precision of someone who'd learned that hasty enthusiasm could destroy fragile evidence, and he found himself matching her deliberate pace. "You're a natural at this," she said, when he successfully identified a section where the earth had been turned decades earlier. "Most people rush, want to see immediate results." "Surveying teaches patience," Nolan replied, using one of Martha's old gardening brushes to carefully clear debris from a promising depression. "Accuracy matters more than speed when you're mapping something that other people will depend on. Is that what you're doing here?" "Mapping?" Nolan considered the question as he worked. "In a way, yes. Trying to understand the shape of something important, even if I can't see all of it yet." Down in Cedar Hollow, his absence from the morning coffee gathering had already been noted. Vernon Patch stirred his coffee with unusual vigor, his curiosity clearly eating at him like a persistent itch. "Third day running," he announced to the assembled group. "Nolan's missed 3 days of coffee, and yesterday I saw him loading hiking gear into his truck." Roy Caldwell nodded thoughtfully. "Man's been restless since Martha passed. Maybe he's just working through his grief, getting back to the mountains he used to survey. Or maybe," Duncan Mills said, with the slow consideration of someone putting together a puzzle, "he's gone looking for our mountain hermit. Remember what he said about actually talking to her? The possibility hung in the store's warm air like smoke, fascinating and slightly worrying. None of them had expected Nolan to follow through on his casual suggestion, and the implications made them uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite articulate. "Think we should be concerned?" Vernon asked. "I mean, we don't really know anything about that woman. For all our joking, she's been a complete mystery for 15 years. "Nolan's a grown man," Roy said, but his tone suggested his own unease. "If he wants to go chasing after hermits and buried treasure, that's his business." But even as he spoke, all 4 men found themselves glancing toward the mountains, wondering what kind of conversation might be taking place on the cliff they'd spent so many years discussing from a comfortable distance. Back at Hawk's Edge, Isolde had retrieved something from her pack that made Nolan set down his tools entirely. She held a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth, tied with a ribbon that had once been blue but had faded to the color of winter sky. "Klaus wrote to me," she said, carefully untying the ribbon. Even after he was transferred to the other camp, he found ways to send letters. They had to be smuggled out through sympathetic guards, hidden in supply shipments, passed hand to hand like contraband. She unfolded the cloth to reveal perhaps a dozen letters, written on whatever paper Klaus had been able to find. Official forms, with writing squeezed into margins, torn pieces of military documents, even what appeared to be pages from a book with German text carefully crossed out and English words written between the lines. "I haven't read these in years," Isolde continued, her fingers hovering over the topmost letter. "After my husband died, I packed them away because the grief felt too fresh, too much like betrayal of the good life we'd built together. But lately, I've been thinking that maybe avoiding them was the real betrayal of Klaus, of the promises we made, of the love that was real even if circumstances made it impossible." Nolan waited while she made her decision, understanding that this moment balanced on the edge of something significant. The morning sun had climbed high enough to warm the cliff face, creating small eddies of heated air that carried the scent of pine and stone. "Would you like me to read them?" she asked. "To you, I mean. It might help me understand what he was trying to tell me about this place, about what he buried here." "Only if you want to," Nolan replied. "Some things are too private to share." Isolde selected a letter from the middle of the bundle, one written on official Wehrmacht stationery, with Klaus's careful handwriting covering both sides of the page. This one came just before he was transferred to the camp in Colorado. He was trying to explain why he'd chosen this particular spot for hiding his possessions. She cleared her throat and began to read, translating from the German as she went. "My dearest Isolde, by the time you receive this, I will be gone from the valley we've shared, but my heart remains with you beside the cliff where the hawk sees all. I chose this place because you once told me it reminded you of the castle towers in your grandmother's stories, where knights kept vigil and lovers made promises that echoed through generations." Her voice caught slightly, but she continued. "I have buried our letters here, along with the small things I've managed to keep from my life before this war changed everything. The wooden bird you love so much is only the beginning. I've carved other pieces during these long months, imagining the home we'll build together when peace comes. They wait in the earth like seeds, ready to grow into the life we've dreamed of." Nolan felt something shift in his understanding of the excavation site. This wasn't random searching, it was archaeology of the heart, a careful attempt to recover artifacts of interrupted love. "There's more," Isolde said, her eyes scanning the rest of the letter. "I've made a map of sorts, though not the kind that would help an enemy. Look for the place where the morning shadow of the tall pine touches the cliff face. Count 20 paces toward the valley, then 10 paces north. The earth there knows our story, even if the world has forgotten." They both turned to study the cliff face with new eyes. A lone pine tree, taller than its neighbors, cast a distinct shadow that moved across the stone like a sundial's hand. Following Klaus's directions would place the burial site perhaps 15 feet from where they'd been digging. Shadow would have been different 75 years ago, Nolan observed, his surveyor's training automatically calculating changes in tree growth and light angles. That pine was probably 30 feet shorter in 1944, which means his burial site would be closer to where you've been digging than his directions would suggest, Nolan finished. "You've been searching in the right area all along." Isolde stared at the carefully maintained excavation site. 15 years of patient work suddenly recontextualized by a letter she'd been too grief-stricken to examine closely. "I've been following my heart instead of his directions," she said with something like wonder. "And somehow, that's brought me closer to the truth." They spent the rest of the morning expanding the search area, using Klaus's letter as a guide, but trusting Isolde's instincts about where the earth felt different beneath their tools. By noon, they'd uncovered several areas where the soil showed signs of long-ago disturbance, each one bringing them closer to fulfilling a promise made by two young people who'd never imagined how long love could wait for resolution. As they packed up for the day, Isolde carefully rewrapped the letters, but something in her posture suggested a weight had been lifted. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'll bring the rest of Klaus's letters. It's time to let them help us find what we're looking for." Nolan shouldered his pack, already planning improvements to their search methodology. "Tomorrow," he agreed, understanding that he'd committed himself to something larger than archaeology. He'd become part of a story that had been waiting 75 years for its proper ending. The next morning brought the first hard frost of the season, turning the mountain meadows silver and making each breath visible in the thin air. Nolan arrived at Hawk's Edge to find Isolde already working, but this time she wasn't digging. Instead, she sat on the camp stool he'd brought her, reading through Klaus's letters with the systematic attention of someone finally ready to face buried truths. "I spent most of last night with these," she said without looking up. 40 years I kept them hidden away, thinking I was protecting my marriage, honoring my husband's memory. But I was really just protecting myself from feeling the full weight of what was lost." She held up a letter, written on thin paper that looked like it might have come from a military ration package. "This one explains everything." Klaus wasn't just hiding letters and personal mementos. He was creating what he called a memory chest, a collection of everything that would help us rebuild our lives together after the war. Nolan settled beside the excavation site, noting how the morning light revealed subtle variations in soil color that weren't visible in afternoon shadows. "What kind of things?" "Practical items, mostly." He managed to save some money. American dollars he'd earned doing carpentry work for the camp guards. A few photographs of his family's workshop in Bavaria, pictures of the furniture and carvings they made before the war destroyed everything. "And tools," her voice grew softer. He wrote about the carving tools he'd fashioned from scrap metal, how he planned to teach me woodworking so we could start a furniture business together in whatever town would have us. She reached into her pack and withdrew the wooden bird Klaus had carved for her, holding it up to catch the morning light. The craftsmanship was even more remarkable in full daylight, every feather perfectly defined, the grain of the wood flowing naturally through the bird's form like captured movement. "This was just the beginning," Isolde continued. "He carved other pieces during those final months at the camp, a set of small animals," he said, "that would remind us both of the beauty that existed before the war tried to convince us the world was only about destruction and hatred." Nolan studied the bird in her hands, recognizing the work of someone who understood that art could be a form of resistance, a way of insisting that beauty mattered even in the worst circumstances. "He sounds like a remarkable man." "He was 22 years old," Isolde said, with the gentle sadness of someone who'd had decades to process the cruelty of interrupted potential. "Younger than my grandson is now. But the war aged people quickly, forced them to make decisions and commitments that should have had more time to develop." Naturally, the conversation was interrupted by the sound of voices carrying up from the trail below. Nolan turned to see 3 figures making their way through the trees, Vernon, Roy, and Duncan, moving with the determined curiosity of men who'd finally decided that speculation wasn't enough. "Company," he said quietly. Isolde followed his gaze and sighed. "I wondered when they'd work up the courage to actually visit them. Scene of my supposed eccentricity." 3 men emerged from the tree line with the slightly embarrassed air of people who weren't entirely sure they were welcome. Vernon carried a thermos that probably contained coffee, while Roy had brought what appeared to be homemade sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Duncan, ever practical, had equipped himself with a folding chair. "Morning, Nolan," Vernon called out, his usual joviality tempered by obvious uncertainty about how to address Isolde. We thought you might appreciate some company up here, and maybe," Roy added, looking directly at Isolde with surprising directness, "we thought it was time we properly introduced ourselves to our neighbor, instead of just talking about her like she wasn't a real person with her own story." Isolde studied the 3 men with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read intentions quickly and accurately. After a long moment, she stood and brushed dirt from her hands. "I'm Isolde Berin," she said formally. "And you're the gentleman who've been speculating about my sanity for the past 15 years. The direct acknowledgement hung in the mountain air like a challenge. Duncan shifted uncomfortably in his boots, while Vernon's face reddened with something that might have been shame. "We're sorry about that," Duncan said finally. "We meant no harm, but meaning no harm isn't the same as doing no harm, is it?" "No," Isolde agreed. "It's not." Roy stepped forward, his weathered hands clasped around the sandwich package like a peace offering. "We brought lunch, if you'd be willing to share it with a couple of old fools who should have known better." For a moment, Nolan thought Isolde might refuse. The habit of solitude was strong, and these men represented 15 years of casual judgment. But then something in her expression shifted, perhaps recognizing that isolation had become as much a choice as a necessity. "I suppose," she said carefully, "that everyone deserves a chance to start over." They arranged themselves in a rough circle on the rocky ground, sharing Roy's sandwiches and coffee from Vernon's thermos, while the morning sun climbed higher over the valley. The conversation began awkwardly, full of careful politeness and unspoken apologies, but gradually warmed as the men proved genuinely interested in understanding rather than simply satisfying their curiosity. "So you really are looking for something specific," Vernon said, after Isolde had shared an abbreviated version of Klaus's story. "All these years we thought, well, it doesn't matter what we thought. Buried treasure wasn't entirely wrong," Isolde replied with the first hint of humor Nolan had seen from her. "Just not the kind you were imagining." Roy studied the excavation site with the attention of someone who'd spent his life working with his hands. 15 years is a long time to search without finding anything. Takes real faith to keep going, or real stubbornness, Isolde said. "Some days I wasn't sure which was driving me up this mountain. Maybe both," Duncan suggested. "Maybe faith and stubbornness are two sides of the same coin when you're trying to keep a promise." They talked for another hour, the conversation meandering through stories of loss and persistence, of the ways small communities could both sustain and constrain the people who lived in them. Nolan found himself watching the dynamics between these four people who'd spent 15 years as strangers, noting how quickly genuine curiosity could bridge gaps that assumption had created. When the men finally prepared to leave, Vernon lingered beside the excavation site. "Is there anything we can do to help?" he asked. "Tools, equipment, extra hands for digging?" Isolde considered the offer, her gaze moving between the three faces that had shifted from curiosity to something like concern. "Actually," she said slowly, "there might be. Nolan mentioned that you run the hardware store. Do you have access to metal detectors? Klaus wrote about burying some metal items along with the wooden pieces, and they might be easier to locate." Vernon's face lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found a way to transform past mistakes into present usefulness. "I know exactly where to get one. My nephew runs a treasure hunting club over in Millfield. They've got professional equipment. And," Roy added, "if you need help with the actual digging, well, we're all retired. Got nothing but time and a debt to pay for 15 years of talking without understanding." As the three men made their way back down the trail, Nolan noticed a change in Isolde's posture, less defensive, more open to the possibility that solitude might not be the only way to honor the past. "That went better than expected," she said, carefully rewrapping Klaus's letters. "Sometimes," Nolan replied, thinking about his own journey from comfortable assumptions to genuine engagement. "People just need permission to care about something that matters." They spent the rest of the morning expanding their search grid, but Nolan found himself thinking less about Klaus's buried memory chest and more about the way a simple act of curiosity could transform not just individual understanding, but an entire community's relationship with one of its own members. By noon, when they packed up their tools, Hawk's Edge felt different, less like a place of solitary grief and more like the beginning of something that might, eventually, become a shared story of redemption. Vernon arrived at Hawk's Edge the following afternoon, carrying a professional metal detector and wearing the expression of someone who'd discovered an unexpected purpose. Behind him, Duncan and Roy struggled up the trail with a card table, folding chairs and a cooler that suggested they'd planned for an extended stay. "My nephew's detector," Vernon announced, hefting the device with obvious pride. "Top of the line," he says. "Can distinguish between different types of metal, even estimate how deep things are buried." Nolan helped them set up what was rapidly becoming a base camp, complete with the card table for mapping their search grid and chairs for the increasingly frequent rest breaks that men in their 60s and 70s required. The transformation of Hawk's Edge from Isolde's solitary refuge into a community project had happened with surprising speed, but she seemed to accept the change with the pragmatic grace of someone who'd learned that life rarely followed expected patterns. "Klaus would have been amazed," she said, watching Vernon carefully adjust the metal detector's settings according to instructions he'd written on his palm. "He spent so much time alone in that camp, dreaming about the community we'd build together after the war. He never imagined that strangers would one day volunteer to help, dig up the future he'd buried." The detector's first sweep of the area produced a symphony of electronic beeps and whistles that sent Vernon into paroxysms of excitement. "Got something?" he called out, marking spots with small orange flags he'd borrowed from the highway department. Lots of somethings, actually. But as they quickly discovered, 75 years of mountain weather had deposited a remarkable variety of metal debris across the site. Bottle caps, coins dropped by hikers, fragments of old camping equipment, and what appeared to be pieces of a weather monitoring device created a metallic landscape that made precise location difficult. "This is going to take patience," Nolan observed, using his surveyor's training to create a systematic grid for their search. "We need to investigate each signal methodically, document what we find, and map everything so we don't duplicate our efforts." Roy, who'd spent 40 years as a mechanic, proved surprisingly adept at distinguishing between the detector's various signals. "That high-pitched whine means something small and close to the surface," he explained to the others. "The deeper tone suggests something larger, or buried deeper. And that warbling sound, that means multiple objects close together." It was the warbling signal that caught their attention late in the afternoon, coming from an area about 10 feet from Isolde's original excavation site. The detector's readings suggested several metal objects buried approximately 3 feet down, clustered together in a space no larger than a shoebox. "This could be it," Isolde said, her voice tight with 15 years of accumulated hope and fear. "Klaus wrote about wrapping everything in oilcloth inside a metal box he'd fashioned from camp kitchen supplies." They began digging with the careful precision of archaeologists, removing soil in measured layers and sifting everything through screens to ensure they didn't miss smaller artifacts. Duncan, despite his initial skepticism about the entire enterprise, proved to have a natural talent for the methodical work, his hands moving with the steady rhythm of someone who understood that rushing could destroy what patience might preserve. At 2.5 feet down, Nolan's trowel struck something that rang with the hollow sound of metal. The others gathered around as he carefully brushed soil away from what appeared to be a corner of a rectangular container, roughly the size of a cigar box, but made from hammered tin that showed the distinctive marks of handcraft rather than machine production. "Klaus made this himself," Isolde said, recognizing the crude but effective soldering at the box's corners. "He wrote about learning metalwork from one of the other prisoners, a man who'd been a tinsmith before the war. The box was wedged tightly in the earth, held in place by 75 years of settling soil and root growth. They worked for another hour, carefully excavating around it until the container could be lifted free without damage. The weight surprised them, heavier than expected, suggesting contents that had survived the decades better than anyone had dared hope. "Should we open it here?" Vernon asked, his voice hushed with the reverence appropriate to a moment that had been building for 3/4 of a century. Isolde held the box in her hands, feeling its weight and the slight roughness of Klaus's amateur metalwork. Not here, she decided. This deserves privacy. Somewhere Klaus and I can have our reunion without an audience. But even as she spoke, she seemed to recognize that the excavation had become larger than her personal quest for closure. These men had invested their own time and effort, had transformed themselves from casual observers to active participants in her story. They deserved to witness the conclusion they'd helped make possible. Tomorrow, she said, compromising with herself. Bring your wives if they're interested. This story belongs to the whole community now, and Klaus would have wanted to meet all the people who helped bring him home. The suggestion transformed the men's expressions from respectful disappointment to something like anticipation. Over the past few days, their morning coffee conversations had shifted from speculation about Isolde's eccentricity to updates on the search progress, and their wives had begun asking pointed questions about why they were spending so much time on the mountain with that woman. "Martha always wanted to meet you," Roy said to Isolde. "My Martha, I mean not Nolan's. She used to see you at the grocery store and wonder about your story, but she was too polite to pry." "Bring her," Isolde replied. "Bring all of them." Klaus spent too much time alone. He would have loved having a crowd of people interested in his story. As they carefully packed the metal box in layers of soft cloth, Nolan found himself thinking about the way hope could transform not just individuals, but entire communities. A week ago, these 4 people had been strangers, connected only by geography and casual assumptions. Now they were collaborators in an act of historical recovery that felt somehow essential to understanding not just Klaus and Isolde's story, but their own relationships to love, loss, and the promises that define a life. The hike down the mountain that evening felt different from previous descents. Where once Isolde had walked alone, carrying the weight of 15 years searching, now she moved as part of a group that had become invested in her success. The metal box, secured in Vernon's daypack, represented not just Klaus's buried hopes, but the community's growing understanding of what it meant to truly support one of their own. "Whatever we find in that box tomorrow," Duncan said as they reached the trailhead, "I want you to know that these past few days have been the most meaningful work I've done since retirement. Thank you for letting us help." Isolde paused beside her truck, Klaus's box safely transferred to her own care. "Thank you for caring enough to climb a mountain for the sake of 2 people you'd never met." As they went their separate ways that evening, each carrying the anticipation of tomorrow's revelation, Hawk's Edge settled into twilight with the satisfied quiet of a place where long-held secrets were finally ready to emerge into the light. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with a crystalline quality to the air that made distant mountains appear close enough to touch. By the time Nolan reached Hawk's Edge, he found an unexpected gathering taking shape, not just the original group of men, but their wives, several other townspeople, and even Father McKinney from St. Joseph's, who'd apparently heard about the discovery through the mysterious communication networks that connected small communities. Isolde sat apart from the growing crowd, Klaus's metal box cradled in her lap like a sleeping child. She dressed carefully for the occasion, her best hiking clothes, a wool sweater that brought out the silver in her hair, and the kind of quiet dignity that suggested she understood the historical significance of what was about to unfold. "I didn't expect so many people," she admitted to Nolan as he settled beside her on the rocky outcrop. "Word travels fast in a small town. Are you comfortable with this?" he asked, noting the way her hands trembled slightly against the metal box. "We can ask them to give us privacy." She considered the faces gathered around their makeshift base camp, genuine curiosity mixed with respectful anticipation, the kind of attention that sought to honor rather than exploit. No, she decided. Klaus spent too much of his life hidden away, dismissed as just another enemy prisoner. He deserves to have his story heard by people who care about promises kept and love that endures. Martha Caldwell, Roy's wife, approached with the careful deference of someone who understood she was witnessing something sacred. "I brought thermos coffee and some of my apple bread," she said quietly. "Thought folks might appreciate warming up before you opened Klaus's box." The simple gesture broke some of the tension that had been building around the moment. People settled into a rough circle, sharing coffee and conversation, while Isolde gathered the emotional strength necessary for a reunion that had been 75 years in the making. "Klaus wrote one more letter," she said finally, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "The last one I received, just before he was transferred to Colorado. I've saved it all these years because it felt like saying goodbye to read it. But I think it's time." She withdrew the familiar bundle of letters from her pack, selecting one that looked different from the others, written on better paper with more careful penmanship, as if Klaus had known it might be his final communication with the woman he loved. "My dearest Isolde," she began, translating from German as she read. "By the time you receive this letter, I will be gone from our valley. But I carry with me the certainty that love like ours cannot be destroyed by distance or time, or the madness of men who mistake war for purpose." Her voice caught, but she continued. "I have buried more than letters and carved animals in our special place. Hidden with them is my grandmother's journal, the one she kept during the First War when she lost my grandfather to battles fought in countries whose names she couldn't pronounce. She taught me that grief and hope are not opposites but partners, that the deepest sorrow comes from love that refuses to be extinguished." The crowd listened with the absolute attention reserved for stories that illuminated fundamental truths about human nature. Even the children who'd followed their parents up the mountain seemed to understand that they were witnessing something important. "The journal contains more than her private thoughts," Isolde continued. "She recorded our family's stories, the traditions and songs and small wisdoms that make us who we are beneath the uniforms and politics that try to define us as enemies. I want you to have these stories, Isolde, because you understand that a person is more than the worst moment of their history." She paused, looking around at the faces gathered on the cliff. "There's more, but it's personal. The important thing is that Klaus believed his grandmother's journal would help us understand each other's families, would give us the foundation for building something new together after the war ended, with ceremony appropriate to the moment." Isolde began opening Klaus's metal box. The oilcloth wrapping had protected its contents remarkably well. The mountain's dry air and the tight seal Klaus had achieved with his amateur metalwork had created conditions that preserved organic materials far better than anyone had expected. The first item she withdrew was a leather-bound journal, small enough to fit in a coat pocket, but thick with closely written pages. The leather had darkened with age, but remained supple, and the pages inside showed no signs of water damage or deterioration. "Klaus's grandmother's journal," she said softly, opening it carefully to reveal lines of German script written in fading blue ink. She wrote about the First War, about waiting for news from the front, about the way communities held together when everything else was falling apart. The second item was a small wooden box, carved with the same skill Klaus had brought to the bird he'd made for Isolde. Inside, wrapped in cloth that had once been white, were a dozen small wooden animals, a deer, a rabbit, an owl, a fox, each one capturing some essential quality of its subject with remarkable economy of line and form. "His menagerie," Isolde whispered, lifting each piece with the reverence due to artifacts of interrupted dreams. "He planned to teach our children to carve, to pass along the skills his own grandfather had taught him before the war changed everything." The third item made several people gasp, a small canvas bag containing what appeared to be jewelry. Not expensive pieces, but the kind of simple, meaningful ornaments that marked important occasions in ordinary lives. A silver locket, a plain gold ring, a pair of earrings that might have belonged to Klaus's mother or sister. "Family treasures," Isolde explained, her fingers tracing the familiar weight of the locket. "Things he managed to keep when everything else was taken away." He wanted me to have them, to understand that marrying him meant joining a family that would welcome me as their own. But it was the final item that stopped her completely. A letter addressed not to her, but to someone named Heinrich Berin, written in Klaus's careful English rather than his native German. "That's my maiden name," she said, staring at the envelope with something like shock. "Heinrich was my father, but how could Klaus have known? We never discussed family names." It was too dangerous. She opened the letter with shaking hands, her eyes scanning lines that had waited 75 years to deliver their message. As she read, her expression shifted through surprise, understanding, and finally something that might have been relief. "Klaus wasn't just any prisoner," she said finally, looking up at the assembled crowd with wonder in her voice. "He was part of the German resistance, captured while trying to sabotage a supply depot that was supporting SS units. He was sent to our camp specifically because military intelligence wanted him interrogated by someone who spoke fluent German, someone they could trust to identify other resistance members among the prisoners." She held up the letter, her hands no longer trembling. "He knew my father's name because they'd planned this from the beginning. Klaus volunteered to be captured, volunteered to endure imprisonment, because he and my father were working together to provide intelligence about German troop movements and resistance networks. The revelation transformed everything they thought they knew about Klaus and his older story. This wasn't just a wartime romance between a lonely translator and a homesick prisoner. It was a love affair that had grown from shared commitment to fighting fascism. A partnership that had begun with purpose and deepened into something personal and profound. "My father never told me," Isolde said, tears streaming down her face. "All these years, I thought our love was just a beautiful accident, something that happened despite the war. But we were chosen for each other, brought together by people who understood that the best way to fight hatred was to create connections that transcended the boundaries others insisted were absolute." As the implications of Klaus's letter settled over the gathering, Hawk's Edge felt charged with the kind of significance that transforms ordinary places into historical landmarks. This cliff, this weathered outcrop overlooking a forgotten valley, had become the site where a 75-year-old mystery had finally revealed its deeper truths about courage, love, and the ways that individual choices could ripple through generations. But Klaus's metal box held one more secret, hidden beneath a false bottom that Nolan's trained eye detected when the container seemed lighter than its external dimensions suggested. Working carefully with his pocket knife, he pried up what appeared to be the base of the box to reveal a small compartment containing something wrapped in multiple layers of oilcloth. "There's more," he said quietly, drawing everyone's attention back to the box that had already yielded so many surprises. Isolde unwrapped the package with the methodical care of someone who understood that this final item might be the most significant of all. What emerged made several people step back in shock: a heavy gold medallion, roughly the size of a silver dollar, bearing symbols that even those unfamiliar with military history could recognize as distinctly Nazi in origin. The medallion was inscribed with an eagle clutching a swastika, surrounded by German text that identified it as some kind of ceremonial award. But more disturbing than the medallion itself was what accompanied it: a small piece of paper with Klaus's handwriting in English, apparently explaining the artifact's significance. "This medallion belonged to SS Oberfuhrer Wilhelm Kraus," Isolde read, her voice growing steadier as she processed Klaus's explanation. "He commanded the unit responsible for executing captured resistance fighters in our region before he was reassigned to oversee prisoner transfers in America. I took this from his personal effects when our unit captured his transport convoy in 1943. She looked up at the assembled crowd, seeing her own confusion reflected in their faces. Klaus was a resistance fighter before he was captured. He wasn't just any prisoner. He was someone who'd been actively fighting against the Nazi regime from within Germany itself. But the letter continued, and its implications grew more complex with each line. Kraus was using his position in the American prisoner program to identify Nazi war criminals who were attempting to hide among regular Wehrmacht prisoners. His plan was to help high-ranking SS officers escape justice by providing them with new identities and safe passage to South America. Father McKinney, who'd been silent throughout the morning's revelations, stepped forward with the troubled expression of someone wrestling with moral complexity. "Are you saying this Klaus fellow was trying to stop Nazi war criminals from escaping justice?" "That's exactly what he was doing," Isolde confirmed, reading further in the letter. "I volunteered to be captured and transferred to the American camp because our intelligence network had learned that Kraus was operating from there. My mission was to gather evidence of his escape network and identify which prisoners were actually war criminals using false identities." Vernon, still clutching his metal detector like a talisman, shook his head in amazement. "So when you fell in love with him, I was falling in love with a man who'd risked everything to ensure that the people responsible for mass murder couldn't simply disappear into comfortable anonymity," Isolde finished. "Klaus wasn't just fighting a war, he was fighting for the principle that actions have consequences, that justice matters even when it's difficult and dangerous to pursue." The medallion felt heavier in her hands as she continued reading Klaus's explanation. Kraus kept detailed records of his escape network, hidden in a second location that I discovered before our convoy was captured. I've buried these documents along with the medallion, evidence that could expose dozens of war criminals who successfully escaped justice with American government assistance. The implications hit the gathering like a physical blow. What they'd assumed was a simple love story had revealed itself as something far more complex, a tale of espionage, justice, and the ways that individual choices during wartime could have consequences that echoed through generations. "The documents," Nolan said, his surveyor's mind automatically calculating possibilities. "If Klaus buried additional evidence, we need to find it." But Isolde was shaking her head, tears streaming down her face as she reached the end of Klaus's letter. "I will not live to see justice done," she read. "Your convoy was attacked during transfer to the Colorado camp, and I was mortally wounded in the escape attempt. By the time you read this, I will be dead. But the evidence remains hidden where only you can find it. Look for the place where we carved our initials, where we promised to meet again when the war ended." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind moving through the pine trees above them. Everyone present was processing the same devastating realization. Klaus had died trying to escape and return to Isolde, had spent his final months not just dreaming of their reunion, but working to ensure that his evidence against war criminals would survive even if he didn't. "The initials," Martha Caldwell said softly. "Did you and Klaus carve your initials somewhere?" Isolde nodded, her composure finally cracking under the weight of 75 years of accumulated loss. "The old pine tree, the one we used to calculate the shadow measurements. There's a heart carved about 6 feet up the trunk, with our initials inside. I've passed it hundreds of times over the years, but I thought it was just a memorial to what we'd lost." Roy was already moving toward the pine tree, his mechanic's practical approach to problems asserting itself despite the emotional complexity of the moment. If he buried something there, the metal detector should pick it up. But as they gathered around the tree, studying the faded heart carved into bark that had grown and weathered over 7 decades, Nolan realized they were dealing with something larger than a simple treasure hunt. If Klaus's evidence had survived, if his documentation of Nazi war criminals' escape networks was still hidden somewhere on this mountain, they had stumbled into a historical discovery that could have international implications. "We need to think carefully about this," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood the weight of unintended consequences. If Klaus was right, if there are documents here that expose war criminals, this isn't just about Isolde's personal closure anymore. This is about justice that was never served, about accountability that was deliberately prevented by people in positions of authority. Duncan, who'd been quiet throughout the morning's revelations, stepped forward with the determined expression of someone who'd made a difficult decision. "Then we find those documents," he said simply. "Klaus died trying to ensure justice was done. The least we can do is help him finish the job." Vernon began adjusting his metal detector settings, but his movements were more deliberate now, less excited. They all understood that what had begun as a community effort to help one woman find closure had transformed into something with implications that reached far beyond Cedar Hollow. "Are we prepared for what we might find?" Father McKinney asked, his question addressed to the group, but his eyes fixed on Isolde. "Evidence of this magnitude, it could bring attention we're not ready for. Scrutiny that might be difficult to handle." Isolde stood and walked to the pine tree, placing her hand against the bark just below the carved heart that had waited 75 years for someone to understand its true significance. "Klaus died believing that some things matter more than personal comfort," she said. "Truth matters. Justice matters. And keeping faith with people who gave everything to ensure that evil doesn't simply disappear into convenient amnesia, that matters most of all." She turned back to face the assembled group, her expression showing the kind of resolve that had sustained 15 years of solitary searching. "We're going to find Klaus's evidence, and we're going to make sure it reaches people who can still do something meaningful with it. Not for revenge, not for publicity, but because Klaus was right. Actions have consequences, and some debts to justice don't expire just because time passes." As Vernon fired up the metal detector and began systematically scanning the area around the pine tree, Hawk's Edge felt transformed once again. What had been a place of personal pilgrimage had become the site of a historical reckoning, where long-buried secrets were finally ready to emerge into the light of contemporary justice. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cliff face, and somewhere in those shadows, Klaus's final gift to the world waited to be discovered by people who understood that love and justice were not separate forces, but two aspects of the same commitment to ensuring that truth endures long enough to matter. The metal detector's warbling signal came from beneath the pine tree's root system, approximately 4 feet down and slightly to the north of the carved heart. But extracting Klaus's second cache would require more than the careful hand tools they'd used for the first excavation. The roots had grown through and around whatever he'd buried, creating a natural vault that would need to be approached with both archaeological precision and forestry expertise. "We'll need professional help," Nolan said, studying the way massive roots disappeared into the earth around the tree's base. "This isn't something we can handle with camp shovels and enthusiasm." Vernon was already pulling out his cell phone, though the mountain location meant he'd have to hike partway down the trail to get reliable service. "My nephew knows an arborist over in Millfield, someone who specializes in root system excavation without damaging the tree." And he added with the satisfaction of someone who'd found the perfect solution, "The county has archaeological protocols for situations like this. We do this right, with proper documentation and legal oversight." The suggestion of involving official authorities created a new tension within the group. What had begun as a private quest for personal closure was rapidly expanding into something with historical and potentially legal implications that none of them were prepared to handle alone. Father McKinney, who'd been quietly observing the morning's developments, stepped forward with the thoughtful expression of someone who'd spent decades helping people navigate complex moral decisions. "Before we involve outside authorities, perhaps we should consider what Klaus would have wanted." His letter suggests he trusted Isolde to make decisions about how his evidence should be used. Isolde stood beside the pine tree, her hand still resting against the bark near the carved initials, and Nolan could see her wrestling with responsibilities she'd never expected to shoulder. For 15 years, her mission had been simple: find Klaus's buried mementos and achieve the closure that had eluded her since the war ended. Now she faced decisions that could affect not just her own peace of mind, but potentially dozens of families whose relatives had escaped justice 7 decades earlier. Klaus wrote about documentation, she said slowly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the magnitude of what they might discover. Names, dates, evidence of systematic efforts to help war criminals escape prosecution. If that information still exists, if it's preserved well enough to be useful, then keeping it private would be a betrayal of everyone who died trying to ensure justice was served. Roy, who'd been unusually quiet since the discovery of the Nazi medallion, cleared his throat and spoke with the careful consideration of someone who'd spent his life fixing practical problems. My grandson's a lawyer over in the state capital, specializes in international law and historical justice cases. Maybe we should consult with him before we do anything that can't be undone. The suggestion resonated with the group's growing awareness that they'd stumbled into something far larger than personal history. Duncan pulled out a notebook and began making lists with the methodical attention to detail that had made him successful in business before retirement. "We need a plan," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd managed complex projects. "First, we get professional help with the excavation, do it right, document everything, preserve whatever we find. Second, we consult with legal experts who understand the implications of historical evidence. Third, we contact appropriate authorities, Holocaust museums, international justice organizations, people who know how to handle this kind of material responsibly." Martha Caldwell, who'd been helping organize the morning's refreshments, looked up from packing thermoses with the practical concern of someone who understood community dynamics. And fourth, we prepare for the media attention this is going to bring to Cedar Hollow. Once word gets out that Nazi war criminal evidence has been discovered here, our quiet little town is going to become very busy very quickly. The observation sobered everyone present. None of them had anticipated that Isolde's personal quest would transform their mountain community into the center of international historical attention. But the implications of Klaus's evidence made such attention inevitable. "There's something else to consider," Nolan said. "His surveyor's training, making him automatically think about timing and logistics. Weather's turning. We've got maybe 2 weeks before winter conditions make this site inaccessible until spring. If we're going to do this excavation properly, with professional oversight and documentation, we need to move quickly." Isolde walked away from the group, moving to the edge of the cliff where she could look out over the valley that had shaped so much of her life. The others gave her space, understanding that the decisions ahead would ultimately be hers to make. But Nolan found himself following her, drawn by something in her posture that suggested she was wrestling with more than just practical considerations. "Having second thoughts?" he asked quietly. "Wondering what Klaus would think about all this," she replied, her eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "He was 22 when he died, full of idealism about justice and truth and the importance of doing what's right, regardless of personal cost. But I'm 73. And I've learned that good intentions can have consequences you never anticipated." Nolan stood beside her, thinking about his own decades of marriage to Martha. The way time had taught him that love meant protecting people, not just from obvious dangers, but from the unintended complications that could arise from even the most well-meaning actions. "Klaus trusted you to make these decisions," he said finally. "Not Klaus, the idealistic 22-year-old. But you, the woman who spent 15 years keeping faith with his memory, who understood better than anyone what his evidence was meant to accomplish." Behind them, the group continued their planning discussions, their voices carrying the subdued intensity of people who understood they were making decisions that would affect not just their own lives, but potentially dozens of others. Vernon had returned from his phone calls with confirmations. The arborist could be there within 2 days. The county archaeologist was intrigued enough to expedite the permitting process, and his nephew's treasure hunting club had offered to provide additional metal detection equipment if needed. "There's one more thing," Isolde said, turning back toward the assembled group. "Something I haven't told you about Klaus's final letter." She returned to where she'd left the letter beside Klaus's metal box, picking it up with the careful attention of someone handling something precious and fragile. He wrote a postscript, something he added after finishing the main letter. I didn't read it aloud earlier because it was meant for me personally. The group gathered around her, their earlier planning discussions temporarily suspended. Isolde looked down at Klaus's handwriting, her fingers tracing lines that had waited 75 years to deliver their final message. "My beloved Isolde," she read, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "If you're reading this, then you have already discovered that love can survive anything: war, separation, death, and the cruelty of people who mistake hatred for strength. The evidence I have hidden will help ensure that evil cannot simply disappear into comfortable amnesia, but more importantly, your decision to search for it proves that some promises are too important to be broken by time or circumstance." She paused, looking around at the faces gathered on the cliff, people who'd started the day as casual acquaintances and had somehow become collaborators in an act of historical recovery. "Do not carry this burden alone," Klaus's letter continued. "Find people who understand that justice delayed is not justice denied, that truth matters enough to be worth protecting across generations. Trust them to help you finish what we started. Because love that creates justice is love that transforms not just individuals, but entire communities." The letter's final lines seemed to speak directly to their current situation, as if Klaus had somehow anticipated the exact circumstances under which his evidence would be discovered. "Whatever you decide about the documents I have hidden, know that you have already fulfilled the most important promise we made to each other. You have refused to let love be defeated by hatred, refused to let hope be destroyed by loss. Everything else is simply the work that love makes possible when it refuses to be conquered by time." As Isolde finished reading, the autumn wind moved through the pine boughs above them with a sound like distant approval. The practical planning they'd been engaged in suddenly felt less like burden and more like opportunity, a chance to demonstrate that Klaus had been right about the transformative power of love that refuses to be limited by individual concerns. "Well then," Vernon said, his voice carrying the determined cheerfulness of someone who'd found his purpose, "I guess we'd better get that arborist up here and see what other surprises Klaus left for us." Father McKinney stepped forward and placed his hand on Isolde's shoulder with the gentle authority of someone who'd spent decades helping people navigate moments when personal faith intersected with public responsibility. "Klaus was right about community," he said. "Some burdens are too important to carry alone, and some promises are too significant to be kept in isolation. Whatever we discover in that second cache, we'll face it together, all of us, as neighbors who understand that justice delayed can still be justice served, if the right people are willing to do the difficult work of ensuring truth survives long enough to matter." As the group began their descent from Hawk's Edge that afternoon, each person carried not just the weight of Klaus's revelations, but the growing understanding that they'd become part of something larger than any of them had anticipated, a story that connected personal love to historical justice, individual promises to community responsibility, and the courage to search for truth to the wisdom needed to handle it appropriately when it was finally found. 2 days later, Hawk's Edge resembled a carefully organized archaeological site more than the solitary refuge it had been for 15 years. Dr. Sarah Hendricks, the county archaeologist, had arrived with equipment and assistance, while Tom Morrison, the arborist Vernon's nephew had recommended, brought specialized tools for root excavation that would preserve both the tree and whatever Klaus had buried beneath it. But the morning's most significant arrival was Isolde herself, accompanied by a tall, silver-haired man in his 40s, who introduced himself as James Caldwell, Roy's grandson, the international law specialist who'd driven up from the state capital to provide legal guidance for whatever they might discover. "I've been researching Nazi war crimes cases all night," James explained as the group gathered around their expanded base camp. If Klaus's evidence is authentic, if it documents successful escapes by high-ranking SS officers, then we're potentially dealing with cases that are still actively pursued by international justice organizations. Some of these people may still be alive, and their estates certainly are. Dr. Hendricks, a woman in her 50s, who carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades extracting historical truth from reluctant earth, listened to Klaus's story with the professional attention of someone evaluating evidence rather than enjoying drama. The time frame is significant, she said, studying Klaus's original metal box and its contents. 1944 was when systematic efforts to establish escape routes for war criminals were reaching their peak efficiency. If your Klaus was documenting American collaboration with these efforts, his evidence could fill crucial gaps in historical understanding. Tom Morrison had been working since dawn, using pneumatic tools and careful hand excavation to follow the metal detector's signals through the maze of routes that surrounded Klaus's second cache. By mid-morning, he'd exposed what appeared to be another metal container, this one larger than the first, and wedged deeply between two major roots that had grown around it like protective arms. "It's going to take time," he called out from his position beside the tree. "The roots haven't damaged the container, but they've essentially grown it into the tree's structure. I need to be very careful not to harm either the tree or whatever's inside the box." The careful excavation process gave everyone time to process the magnitude of what they were attempting. Media attention had already begun. A reporter from the regional newspaper had somehow learned about the discovery and called Roy's house that morning, asking pointed questions about Nazi gold and hidden treasure that demonstrated how quickly accurate information could become sensationalized speculation. "We need to control the narrative," James advised, his legal training evident in his systematic approach to potential problems. "Once this story becomes public, we'll lose the ability to ensure Klaus's evidence is handled appropriately. Treasure hunters, conspiracy theorists, Holocaust deniers, they'll all want to claim pieces of this story for their own purposes." Isolde stood apart from the increasing activity, her attention focused on the carved initials that had waited 75 years for this moment of revelation. Nolan noticed her isolation and moved to stand beside her, understanding that the woman who'd spent 15 years searching in solitude might be overwhelmed by the sudden transformation of her private quest into a public archaeological event. "Too many people?" he asked quietly. "Klaus would have been amazed," she replied, watching Dr. Hendricks document every aspect of the excavation with photographic precision. He died believing his evidence would never be found, that the war criminals he'd identified would escape justice because no one would ever know they'd been. "Here," Tom Morrison's voice carried across the site, with the excitement of someone who just solved a complex puzzle. "I can see the container clearly now," he called out. "It's intact, sealed with what looks like military-grade waterproofing. Give me another hour, and I should be able to extract it without damaging the contents." Father McKinney, who'd arrived early to offer whatever spiritual support the day's revelations might require, moved closer to Isolde with the gentle concern of someone who understood that profound moments often required simple human presence more than complex theological commentary. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his question encompassing not just the physical opening of Klaus's second cache, but the emotional and historical implications of whatever they might discover. "I've been ready for 75 years, Isolde replied, but her voice carried the uncertainty of someone who'd imagined this moment countless times, without ever truly believing it would arrive. "Klaus trusted me to ensure his evidence reached people who could use it appropriately. I just never imagined those people would include half the town of Cedar Hollow and a team of professional archaeologists." As if summoned by her words, Dr. Hendricks approached with the careful expression of someone who'd spent her career balancing historical significance with human sensitivity. "Mrs. Barron," she said formally, Before we proceed with opening Klaus's second container, I want you to understand what we're likely to find. Based on your description of his letter and the time frame involved, we're probably looking at documentation that could reopen investigations into some of the most significant unsolved war crimes cases of the 20th century. She paused, studying Isolde's face with professional compassion. Once we open that container, once we document and authenticate its contents, there's no going back to privacy. This will become historical evidence, subject to legal processes and public scrutiny that may continue for years. Isolde looked around at the faces. Gathered on the cliff, people who'd transformed, from distant neighbors to active collaborators in a quest for justice that had outlived the man who initiated it. Klaus knew the risks when he buried this evidence, she said finally. He chose truth over safety, justice over comfort. The least I can do is honor that choice by seeing his mission through to completion. Tom Morrison emerged from his excavation site, carefully cradling a metal container that was noticeably larger than Klaus's first cache. "It's ready," he announced, his voice carrying the solemnity appropriate to a moment that had been building for 3/4 of a century. The second container opened with a metallic whisper that seemed to echo across 7 decades of patient waiting. Inside, wrapped in multiple layers of oiled cloth that had protected their contents with remarkable effectiveness, lay Klaus's final gifts to justice, a thick bundle of documents, several photographs, and what appeared to be a detailed map with locations marked. Throughout the American Southwest, Dr. Hendricks worked with the methodical precision of someone who understood that historical artifacts required careful handling to preserve both their physical integrity and their evidential value. As she carefully unwrapped the first document bundle, the extent of Klaus's intelligence gathering became apparent. These weren't casual observations, but systematic documentation created by someone who understood the importance of detailed record-keeping. "This is extraordinary," she murmured, photographing each item before allowing anyone to handle it. "He's documented names, dates, locations, transport arrangements. This reads like a complete operational manual for war criminal escape operations." James Caldwell studied the documents over Dr. Hendricks' shoulder, his legal training evident in the way he immediately began cataloging potential evidence. These names, some of them correspond to people who were investigated for war crimes but never prosecuted due to insufficient evidence. If Klaus's documentation is authentic, it could provide the missing links that prosecutors needed. The photographs were perhaps the most damning evidence. Klaus had somehow managed to document meetings between SS officers and American officials, showing faces and locations that would have been impossible to deny if they'd been available during the original war crimes trials. One photograph showed a group of men in civilian clothes standing beside military vehicles, with Klaus's careful handwriting on the back, identifying each individual and their respective roles in the escape network. "My God," Father McKinney whispered, studying a photograph that showed SS Oberfuhrer Wilhelm Krauss in animated conversation with someone wearing an American military uniform. Klaus was risking his life every time he gathered this evidence, but it was the map that provided the most comprehensive view of Klaus's discoveries. He'd marked dozens of locations across multiple states, each one annotated with dates, names, and brief descriptions of activities. Safe houses, transportation hubs, document forgery operations, financial networks. The scope of the war criminal escape operation was far larger than anyone had suspected. "This changes everything we thought we knew about post-war justice efforts," Dr. Hendricks said, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who'd just uncovered a major historical discovery. Klaus documented a systematic effort to subvert international justice, operating with apparent official cooperation at the highest levels of American government. Isolde stood beside the open container, tears streaming down her face as she processed the magnitude of what Klaus had accomplished during his final months of life. This wasn't just evidence, it was a comprehensive indictment of institutional failure. created by a 22-year-old prisoner who'd understood that some truths were too important to be buried with their discoverers. He knew he was going to die, she said quietly, her words carrying across the assembled group with the weight of absolute certainty. This level of documentation, this systematic approach, Klaus wasn't gathering evidence for after the war. He was creating a record that would survive even if he didn't. The implications settled over the group like autumn shadows. Klaus hadn't just been a young man in love, dreaming of a post-war reunion with his beloved translator. He'd been a resistance fighter and intelligence gatherer, using his position as a prisoner to document one of the most significant justice failures of the 20th century. James Caldwell was already making phone calls, contacting colleagues who specialized in international war crimes prosecution. I need to get this evidence to people who can authenticate it properly and determine what legal actions might still be possible, he explained between calls. Some of these cases may have descendants who are still living, estates that were built with Nazi gold, institutions that benefited from war criminal money. Tom Morrison, who'd been carefully documenting the excavation site, approached Isolde with something in his expression that suggested the day wasn't finished revealing its secrets. "There's something else," he said quietly. "When I was extracting the container, I found this wedged between the roots, almost like it had been placed there separately." He held out a small object wrapped in cloth, not oilcloth like the other items, but what appeared to be a piece of fabric that had once been part of a shirt or jacket. When Isolde unwrapped it, she found a simple gold ring, obviously a man's wedding band, with an inscription on the inside that made her sink onto the camp stool Nolan had brought her weeks earlier. "For Isolde, with all my love, Klaus," she read, her voice barely audible. "He had this made for me, even knowing he might die, even focused on gathering evidence that could save countless lives. He found time to have a wedding ring, created for a future we'd never share." The ring fit her finger perfectly, as if Klaus had somehow known exactly how to size it, despite the impossibility of accurate measurement under their circumstances. As she held up her hand to study the simple gold band, autumn's sunlight caught the metal and made it glow with warmth that had been waiting 75 years to find its intended recipient. "Now I understand," she said, looking around at the faces of people who'd become far more than neighbors during this extraordinary morning. Klaus wasn't just hiding evidence and mementos. He was creating a legacy, proof that love and justice aren't separate forces, but two aspects of the same commitment to ensuring that truth endures long enough to matter. As the group began the careful process of documenting and preserving Klaus's evidence for transfer to appropriate authorities, Hawk's Edge felt transformed once more. What had begun as one woman's private quest for closure had become a community's participation in historical justice, a demonstration that some promises transcend individual lifetimes and require collective commitment to reach their proper fulfillment. The ring on Isolde's finger caught the light with each movement, a tangible reminder that love which refuses to be defeated by death can accomplish things that seem impossible to those who measure success only in terms of immediate, visible results. 6 months later, Isolde stood at the edge of Hawk's Edge, wearing new hiking boots and watching the morning sun paint the valley in shades of gold and green that spoke of spring's return to the mountains. The cliff face looked different now, not because anything physical had changed, but because the weight of unfulfilled promises no longer pressed against the stone like an invisible burden. Beside her, Nolan adjusted the straps of his own new pack, loaded not with archaeological tools, but with lunch and water for a day of exploration rather than excavation. At 73 and 68 respectively, they discovered that some of life's best adventures began when you stopped searching for what was lost and started appreciating what had been found. "Any regrets?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew her answer. "About Klaus?" "Never." Isolde touched the gold ring that had become as natural on her finger as breathing. "About the media circus? The documentary cruise?" The book deals I keep refusing? Sometimes. But Klaus would have understood that truth comes with complications. The past 6 months had indeed been complicated. Klaus's evidence had triggered investigations across 3 countries, leading to the recovery of millions of dollars in assets that had been hidden for 75 years. 2 men in their 90s, living quietly in Argentina and Brazil, had been identified as war criminals who'd escaped justice with documented American assistance. More importantly, Klaus's meticulous records had provided closure for dozens of families who'd never known what happened to relatives who'd disappeared during the war. The memorial service was perfect, Nolan said, remembering the ceremony they'd held at Hawk's Edge just as spring snow began to melt. Representatives from Holocaust museums, international justice organizations, and German resistance groups had joined. Cedar Hollow residents in honoring both Klaus's sacrifice and Isolde's persistence in ensuring his evidence finally reached people who could act on it. Father McKinney did Klaus proud, Isolde agreed, though I still smile when I remember Vernon's speech about the importance of asking questions instead of making assumptions. Vernon had indeed become something of a local celebrity, giving interviews about the transformation of a small town's casual gossip into genuine community support. The hardware store now featured a small display about the wartime prisoner camp that had existed in their valley, and Vernon had started leading weekend tours for visitors who wanted to understand the historical context of Klaus's discoveries. Speaking of Vernon, Nolan said, checking his watch, shouldn't they be here by now? As if summoned by his words, voices carried up from the trail below, the familiar sound of their hiking group making its weekly pilgrimage to the site that had become as much a symbol of community transformation as historical justice. Vernon, Roy, and Duncan emerged from the tree line, followed by their wives and several newer members who joined what had become known throughout the region as the Hawk's Edge Historical Society. Perfect timing, Martha Caldwell called out, hefting a backpack that undoubtedly contained enough food for twice their number. We brought the coffee and sandwiches, plus some of those cookies Isolde loves. The weekly gatherings had evolved naturally from the intense days of archaeological excavation, becoming a way for the group to maintain the connections they'd forged while participating in something larger than their individual lives. They hiked together, shared meals, discussed books about World War II resistance efforts, and gradually deepened their understanding of how personal choices during historical crises could ripple across generations. Any word from James about the latest developments? Duncan asked, settling into the folding chair he'd claimed as his permanent seat during their gatherings. 3 more asset recovery cases opened last week, Isolde replied, unpacking her contribution to the group lunch. Klaus's documentation keeps revealing new connections, new evidence that prosecutors can use to trace money and property that should have been returned to victims' families decades ago. Father McKinney, who'd become the group's unofficial chaplain and philosopher, looked out over the valley with the contemplative expression of someone who'd spent months thinking about the theological implications of love that transcended death. Klaus accomplished something remarkable, he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd witnessed genuine transformation. He proved that individual commitment to justice, sustained by love and community support, can overcome institutional failures and ensure that truth eventually prevails. Roy, who'd been quietly carving a small wooden bird during their conversation, held up his work for inspection. He'd taken up woodworking after seeing Klaus's carved animals, finding in the craft a way to honor the artistic spirit that had sustained a young resistance fighter during his darkest hours. Klaus would have appreciated our little group, he said, adding finishing touches to the bird's wing details. A bunch of retired folks hiking up a mountain every week to eat sandwiches and solve the world's problems. We solved one problem, Vernon corrected, with the satisfaction of someone who'd discovered that meaningful work could extend well beyond traditional career boundaries. That's more than most people accomplish in a lifetime. As they shared their weekly meal, the conversation meandered through topics that had become familiar themes during their gatherings: the importance of community, the persistence required for justice, the ways that individual choices could create legacies that extended far beyond their creators' lifetimes. "I've been thinking about something Klaus wrote," Isolde said, as they prepared to pack up for the descent. In one of his letters, he mentioned that the best way to honor the dead was to ensure their sacrifices enabled others to live more fully. I think he'd be pleased to know that his evidence didn't just expose war criminals. It brought together a community that had forgotten how to truly support one of its own members. Nolan shouldered his pack, noting how much easier the weight felt when carried for pleasure rather than obligation. "Where to next week?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Same place," Isolde replied, touching the carved initials on the pine tree one more time before turning toward the trail. "Klaus is here now, part of this place and this community in ways he never could have imagined during those final months in the prisoner camp." As the group began their descent from Hawk's Edge, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cliff face where two young people had once carved their initials and made promises they'd trusted would survive even the worst things human beings could do to each other. Their faith had been justified, though in ways neither Klaus nor young Isolde could have anticipated. Love, it turned out, was patient enough to wait 75 years for fulfillment, strong enough to transform casual neighbors into committed allies, and persistent enough to ensure that justice delayed didn't have to mean justice denied, as long as there were people willing to keep faith with promises that mattered more than personal convenience. The mountain held their story now, part of its ancient patience and enduring capacity to shelter truths that required decades to reach their proper flowering. And every week, a small group of friends climbed toward that story, carrying with them the understanding that some things, love, justice, community, and the courage to search for truth, were worth whatever time and effort they required.